Hello and welcome to the final supplementary lecture of the course. The topic is justice, which is a very broad, very expansive topic. As you'll see, there are lots of different varieties of justice. There is political justice, which is justice in terms of how governments are instituted and why. There are certain issues of social justice, that is, what a society should look like, sometimes called economic or distributive justice. There are questions of how resources should be distributed. As you'll see, justice is a really big topic, and of course, we can't do the entire field justice. But what we can do is take a look at some of the more influential, interesting, and long lasting ideas in this very interesting field of philosophy. The first of the big ideas that we'll take a look at is an idea known as social contract theory. There are lots of different varieties of social contract theory. We'll look at a few of the most influential. That is the views of Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and John Rawls. Uh, a social contract theory is a theory of political justice, that is, justice in terms of the way that a government is constituted, or what a government ought to be like, or why we ought to have a government at all. And so each of the next three thinkers are thinkers who will give us a kind of social contract theory. All social contract theories they share a method in common, and the method works something like this. You're supposed to imagine life without some kind of government or without a moral code. And then you, by imagining this, you don't have to actually say that this ever happened, that anyone ever actually lived this way, or anything like that. Sometimes these theories are misunderstood as saying, oh, once upon a time there was no rules at all, and then people had to make them. That's probably not exactly true. Instead, there's a method in common. What you do is you imagine life without some sort of government or moral rules. You just imagine, again, using everything you know about the way that people are, about life in general, and then you can discover some of the problems, right? Sometimes I refer to this as the "It's a Wonderful Life" method of moral reasoning, because essentially this is a reference to the really great film "It's a Wonderful Life," which, if you haven't seen it, get out from under the rock you've been under and go see it. Um, in a sense, in this film, the main character, George Bailey, is has experiences some misfortune and goes out with the intent to kill himself, and because he thinks things have just gone too far off the rails to be saved, and his guardian angel saves his life and shows him what life would really have been like if he hadn't ever existed. And so he realizes how much good he's really done, how valuable, in a sense, how wonderful his life has really been. And that's what we're doing here. We're trying to see how wonderful a moral code is, or how wonderful a government is, by just imagining uh, what life is like without it, right? So imagining what life is like without a particular thing sometimes really does help you to identify what's really important about that thing. And that's the point here. And then the idea is, for step three, you propose a solution to the problems that you have without some sort of government or moral code that any reasonable person then would agree to. And that solution is in effect the social contract. It's the thing that everybody would mutually agree upon if they were being at all reasonable. The very first form of social contract is owed to this man here, who's this is a painting of him, which is why it's in color. This is Thomas Hobbes. He lived from 1588 to 1679, and he's very famous for publication of this really big book called the Leviathan. A lot of times people think that the word Leviathan refers to the size of the book. It does not. It refers to one of the central concepts of the book. Um, Hobbes himself lived through a very, sort of destructive period in European history. He, had all kinds of trouble with the English Civil War, and so he was very much concerned about orderliness, and peace, and the foundations of a stable government. And so those are some of the issues that he wrote about, and his writings really kind of didn't make him popular with really much of anybody at the time. But we owe an enormous amount to his political thought, which was very far-seeing, and very, very important. Just a brief note: Hobbes has something of a reputation for having a very pessimistic view of human nature. That's just one of the things that people will often say about Hobbes. And I myself don't think that this is entirely fair, but I'll let you make up your own mind after just looking at his reasoning, looking at what he does actually say, and I think that you could judge the case for yourself. So remember, step one is to remember or to imagine, sorry, life without any sort of government or moral rules or something like that. And this is what we call the state of nature, or what Hobbes referred to as the state of nature, or people in their natural state. So without government, people are in their natural state. Right? This is what philosophers call this state of nature. And Hobbes points out that the state of nature is a state of equality. And what he means by that is this, that people are more or less evenly matched. That doesn't mean that everybody's exactly the same, but if you really think about it, people are reasonably evenly matched. Yeah, some people are stronger than others, but nobody is so much stronger than anybody else that they can just get whatever they want without any fear of anything. If you did, and some group of people have some brute who, sort of just beat anything they wanted out of anybody, you'd imagine everybody else would simply gang up on them. And even the weakest person is strong enough to be dangerous to the strongest person. So again, people are more or less evenly matched. And the same thing goes for wits. While some people are somewhat more clever than another, nobody is so clever that they can just get everything they want and exclude all others. So even the least clever is clever enough that they can't be entirely underestimated or discounted, even by the very clever. And so neither our brains nor our brawn is so far in advance of everybody else's that we just get whatever we want. Right? And that's what Hobbes means by the state of nature being a state of equality. In addition to that, people are nobody has any authority over anybody else. Right? There's no government, there's no moral code. Nobody really has the right to tell anyone else what to do, and everybody knows it. That's the state of nature that we're imagining. So you know what? Let's imagine this right along with Hobbes. So here you are in the state of nature. There are no rules. You get to do whatever you want, whenever you want. You can wander around the world, pick a little bit of fruit, gather it together. You're going to need that later. You kick back, you relax, you enjoy the pretty trees and whatever else it is you do during in the state of nature. The world, as they say, is your burrito. In fact, the only thing that could really get in the way of all of the great fun you'll have in the state of nature is, well, somebody else. Now you encounter this other person and think, what are they like? What sorts of things do they enjoy? What sorts of things do they need? Right? What are their wants? What are their desires? And in fact, the best answer to that question, given that you don't really know this person, is pretty much always, well, probably pretty much what I like and what I need and what my desires are. And so you notice that, oh, well, they've gathered a little bit of fruit themselves. They do kind of like the same things you like, and they need the same things that you need. And they, not knowing you, are making the same assumptions about you, that you're pretty much like them. You know what? You're both right. You're very much like one another, being both human beings. Well, this is a sketchy situation here. How do you know whether you trust this person? In fact, this person might just be after your fruit. And of course, you see their fruit's a nice little pile of fruit there. You think maybe you ought to even be after their fruit. And of course, what are they thinking? Well, they're thinking exactly the same thing. That maybe you're after their fruit, and maybe they even ought to be after yours. And so you grab your nice shillelagh stick, right? Because who would go into the state of nature without a good shillelagh, right? No rational person would do something like that, which, of course, means that your opponent also has a shillelagh. Of course they would. It's the state of nature. You don't go around without a shillelagh. Are you crazy? Um, and so now it's another standoff, right? If neither of you were armed, it would be just the same sort of standoff. But of course, both of you are, because both of you know that you're prepared to escalate the violence in order to protect your fruit and maybe gain a little more fruit in the balance. So it seems like each of you have two choices, right? You've got the choice of either war or peace, right? That is, you can be prepared for attack or prepared to defend yourself, or you can decide, you know what, this person's okay. I don't need to expend all of my energy being watchful or even contemplating a first strike or anything like that. I choose peace, right? Now you might ask yourself, what choices do they have? Well, same ones as you do. They can choose war or they can choose peace. And so now we have a situation where what each player gets here in this little game depends on the move of the other. And this is a kind of situation that's dealt with by a branch of philosophy called game theory. And so we can break this down into a little bit of a matrix. If, of course, you both choose peace, well, great. You go about your business, they go about their business, no problem. It's live and let live. If you choose peace and your opponent chooses war, well, they get an easy win. They kill you, they get your fruit. But if the opposite happens, you choose war and they choose peace, you get the easy win. You kill them, you take their fruit. And so if you both choose war then, notice you're both prepared for it, and so it's going to be probably a fight to the death. And in such a fight, it's possible you'll both be grievously injured or even fatally injured. So let's call this one a 50-50 at best, right? You've got a fighting chance, but it's likely enough you may suffer a life-changing injury, even if you technically win. Well, now let's think about this from a third-person perspective. If you were somebody else who is not really involved in this situation at all, you're not one of these two people, it seems obvious what the best choice for the both of them is. It's to live and let live, right? They both go on and have their own fruit, and they get to possibly even cooperate with one another. That's what game theorists call the optimal solution. Optimal is just a fancy word that means best, and so that's the best overall outcome. It's the live and let live outcome. But in order to get that outcome, it would require both players to choose peace. Now think about it this way: if you are one of these players, what are you going to pick? If you choose peace, then at best it's a tie, right? You just get the live and let live option. But at worst, there's this possibility of complete disaster, your own death, and of course, even worse, your fruit gets taken by your enemy. Uh, but if you choose war, at best, the best case scenario is an easy win and the elimination of a rival. Whereas the worst case scenario is the tie, where at least you have a fighting chance. And so, since you recognize that war is the most rational option, why would you expect your opponent not to choose war as well? And if you suspect that your opponent's going to choose war, that makes it even less likely that you're going to choose peace, because again, that would lead to disaster for you. Even if you said, to your opponent, you say, you know what, look, buddy, if we both choose peace, we both end up better off. I promise eternal friendship to you. Let us become blood brothers this day, and let us never harm each other. Right? Well, what's that going to sound like from the other side? Even if you really mean it, do you actually expect them to believe you? Likewise, if they say to you, let us make promises here to cross our heart and hope to die and never kill each other ever ever, because I'm a nice guy, you're a nice guy, we can just live together. We'll be fine. It'll be better for us. Even if they mean it, can you afford to believe them? This basic interaction between these two folks, right, between you and this rival of yours, uh, will sort of determine the outcome. The rational choice for each individual is simply to choose war. Right? There's too much risk in believing if they say that they're going to choose peace, right? In fact, saying they were going to choose peace might in fact be the very best move to get you to try and choose peace so they can get an easy win. And likewise with you to them, right? If you can think of the strategy, they can think of the strategy. And so again, the rational decision from the point of view of each of the parties, is to choose war. And so what ends up happening is each of these players get this 50-50 at best outcome, which is actually the worst available outcome. And that's the state of nature. In fact, this particular kind of setup is called a prisoner's dilemma. Prisoner's dilemma is any situation in which the individually rational decision leads people into the overall worst outcome. And there are many of these in life in general. The reason it's called a prisoner's dilemma is because of the example that's usually used to explain it. If you've ever turned on a television, you've probably seen some sort of a cop show or a crime drama or something like that. And it happens frequently enough on these shows that the police suspect a couple of individuals of committing a crime, in cooperation with each other, or of a couple of different people both knowing something about the other, in terms of a crime committed. Uh, and the idea is that the police can't really prove anything without a confession, and so they're going to try and get each of these people to crack. And so what do? They always put them in two separate rooms, and they both tell them the same thing. They both say, "Look, if this other guy rats you out, and he's in the other room, maybe he's singing like a canary. But if he rats you out and you stay quiet, well, you're going to go away for a long time, and he's going to get away scot free. He's going to get a real good deal for the cooperation. But if you rat him out, you're going to get the good deal for cooperation, and then if he stays silent, he goes away for a long time." Well, of course, what happens is that each of these people, in isolation of each other, will mistrust each other enough to say that they'll see the obvious advantages in sort of betraying the other one, even if they expect the other one will, especially if they expect the other one will stay quiet. But even if they expect that the other one will betray them, there's a certain pressure to try and be the one that betrays the other one first, or something like that, or to at least make sure that they guarantee themselves the sort of worst case tie, instead of the sort of exposing themselves to the disaster of going away for a long time while the other one gets away scot free. And so what ends up happening is they end up generally turning on each other, defecting from the partnership or cooperation, and both ratting each other out, and then they both go away, which is, of course, the collective, at least for the two of them, the worst outcome. This idea of a prisoner's dilemma, like I said, has a lot of different applications to social and political life. I'll just give you a couple. One of these is this. Imagine you're a shepherd. If you have a bunch of sheep, and of course you have your own land with your own grass on it, and if you let the sheep graze on it too often, it'll put that in danger. So you got to make sure you save your own land, and make sure the grass recovers enough between grazings to maintain your flock of sheep. But now imagine there's also this parcel of common land. There's nobody really owns it. It's a sort of public land, as it were. There's grass on it. And so where are you going to take your sheep to graze? Well, pretty obviously, you're going to take them to the common land to save your own, right? Because, of course, nobody owns it, so you leave it. Now, imagine there are a bunch of other shepherds in your community. What are they going to pick? Well, they're going to pick the same thing as you picked, and for the same reason. And so everyone's going to graze their sheep on the common land, and it's going to get trashed. It's going to get overused, and then it gets lost as a resource for everybody. And so by doing the individually rational thing, you ended up with a sort of public disaster, the worst overall outcome. And so that's where prisoners' dilemmas really contribute a lot to a lot of environmental damages, because everybody kind of has, an incentive to take advantage of the environment, but nobody has and everybody has a disincentive to be the one to sort of bear the cost of preserving an environment, or sort of conserving various things and resources, like using your own grass instead of using the common land, stuff like that. If you look at, say, the federal budget, right? Every person in Congress has an incentive, right, an electoral incentive to get money out of the budget and into their districts, but everybody has a disincentive to put money from their districts into the budget. That's taxation. And so what happens is you typically get a whole lot more spending from the budget than you get revenue into the budget, right? And then that's kind of how that happens. Again, another large scale multiplayer a prisoner's dilemma, where the individually rational call ends up leading to the collective worst outcome. Now, of course, all of these prisoners' dilemmas have something in common. They all can be gotten out of in more or less the same way. And if a prisoner's dilemma continues to lead us into sort of bad outcomes, well, let's see what it would take to get us out of these bad outcomes, to save us from them to begin with. And so, speaking of bad outcomes, this is how Hobbes ultimately describes what the state of nature is like. It's a very famous paragraph, so I've gone ahead and quoted it in its entirety. He says, "Therefore, whatever results from a time of war, when every man is enemy to every man, also results from a time when men live with no other security but what their own strength and ingenuity provides them with. In such conditions, there is no place for hard work, because there is no assurance that it will yield results, and consequently, no cultivation of the earth, no navigation or use of materials that can be imported by sea, no construction of large buildings, no machines for moving things that require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no practical skills, no literature or scholarship, no society, and worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." Very famous quote from Hobbes. So whenever you hear people talk about life being solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, this is a direct reference to this particular idea of Hobbes, that without a government, in a state of nature, that life would be a sort of a war of everyone against everyone. There would be no room for anything else, and it would be pretty horrible. So here's the thing: nobody will believe you that you've read Hobbes unless you have that whole solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short business, right? Uh, and so, in addition to this particular picture of the state of nature, uh, I mean, let's examine this assumption that he makes. Imagine you're in the state of nature and you decide, I'd love nothing else than just to be a painter and paint my paintings and live my life happily. Well, if you decide to act that way in the state of nature, someone's going to kill you and take your painting. And if you decide, you know what, I'd really like to study ancient languages. And so while you're bent over a scroll somewhere, somebody will kill you and take your, whatever you have, maybe your scroll or your fruit or, whatever, or just kill you just so that you don't ever get any ideas in your head about killing them. So again, there's all of this stuff, that all of the benefits of society, like trade, cooperation, just not having to defend your own life against everybody else all the time because of all the fearful suspicion. All of these things are just absent in the state of nature. All of the good things that a civilization or a society brings with it. And so here's how Hobbes proposes to get out of the state of nature. And he proposes a kind of agreement. That's what the term covenant means here. He says, what if a covenant is made in which the parties do not perform now, but trust one another to perform at an appropriate time in the future? So, what he's talking about here is a kind of long standing agreement. And that's the kind of agreement that a social contract is. It's a long term agreement between all people who are party to the agreement, all parties of the society. He says, if this happens in the condition of mere nature, that is, in the state of nature, which is war of every man against every man, then the contract is void if one of the parties has a reasonable suspicion that the other is not going to perform. For the one who performs first has no assurance that the other will perform later, because the bonds of words are too weak to rein in men's ambition, greed, anger, and other passions, unless there is something to be feared from some coercive power. And in the condition of mere nature, where all men are equal and are judges of the reasonableness of their own fears, there can't possibly be such a power. So he who performs first merely betrays himself to his enemy, which is contrary to his right to defend his life and his means of living. On the other hand, if there is a common power set over both parties to the contract, with right and force sufficient to compel performance, the contract is not made void by the suspicions of either party to it. When there is a power set up to constrain those who would otherwise violate their faith, That fear, namely the suspicion that the other party will not perform, is no longer reasonable. So he who is covenanted to perform first is obligated to do so. So this is Hobbes's proposed way out. And he talks a lot about just the natural psychology of the state of nature. This idea that you don't perform peace because if you do, you feel like you've made yourself out to be possibly the chump in this situation, where the other person will simply take advantage of your peacefulness and get an easy win over you. And so it seems like the only way that you could ever do this is if you both make a promise that you're sort of mutually say, yeah, I'm not going to attack you. If you don't attack me, great, we're all good. And set up some kind of a common power that you both agree has the right, to prevent you from taking out any sort of revenge or preemptive action against anybody else. So this common power Hobbes calls the Leviathan. This is a quote from the Bible, Job chapter 41. The Leviathan's main purpose is to enforce a monopoly on violence. Because, of course, the biggest problem in the state of nature is a security problem. People aren't safe. He says, what is worst is this continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Right, so the idea is for the Leviathan, and some entity, so it could be an organization, it could be a committee, it could be a nice, good, strong king, the way that the Hobbes preferred it. But its main purpose is to enforce a monopoly on violence, right? To say, okay, everybody, you all, right, who are party to this agreement, have put me in charge. None of you get to use violence anymore. That way, you don't have to be afraid of anybody else using it. And if anybody breaks their promise not to use violence, I'm going to come and punish them. Right. So that's essentially the role that the Leviathan plays. So the idea is then that any reasonable person, to avoid the obvious trouble with the state of nature, this obvious security problem, would agree then to give up their right to use violence over to the Leviathan. They would turn over their natural rights to the Leviathan. Say, okay, the Leviathan has what used to be my right to use violence. Now I don't have it anymore. I've renounced it again, as long as everybody else renounces it as well. Puts the Leviathan in charge of all of us. And so let's take a look at how the presence of the Leviathan changes the rationality of the state of nature. So again, here is the Hobbesian trap, or the security dilemma, or the prisoner's dilemma that we face in the state of nature, where both parties are out of just prudence and carefulness, tempted to select war and get the worst outcome. Now, under the Leviathan, we have a sort of a different story. The idea is that the Leviathan reserves the right now to enforce this monopoly on violence. And so if you end up choosing peace and your opponent violates that peace, kills you and takes your fruit, um, or if you do that rather, then, well, of course, the Leviathan will simply kill you. And so you say, well, okay, maybe I don't want to do that. Then maybe I'll choose peace. But you're like, well, what if the other guy chooses war? Well, if the other guy chooses war, well, then the Leviathan will kill them right after they kill you and take your fruit. And so the idea is that that each of you has a kind of disincentive to do that. But the idea is if you both chose war anyway, despite your incentives to choose peace, well, Leviathan kill both of you. So now take a look at this situation. What's the rational choice? If you choose war, you're going to die, right? That's again assuming the very simplest of possible punishments that the Leviathan could use to enforce its monopoly on violence. But the idea is that now all of a sudden, since the rules of the game are changed, the way that people play the game entirely changes as well. Obviously, the rational choice is to choose peace, and that makes a really, really big difference. And so I want to say a couple of things at this point. The first of which is to revisit this question of Hobbes's so-called pessimistic view of human nature. Now, of course, he has a pessimistic view of what the state of nature would be like with humans in it. But notice he's not saying anything about either of these people as being inherently bloodthirsty or inherently savage or inherently violent or anything like that. There's no bloodlust going on here. There's no sort of sense of being red in tooth and claw, or the sense of this violent pressure that just builds up and has to bust out. It's entirely a rational calculation. Each person is simply trying to survive, trying to keep themselves safe, and trying to prosper, and realizing that the other person wants the same things and they can't necessarily both have them, or at least not comfortably. And so the only thing that makes this whole thing go, what the state of nature is like without the Leviathan and what the human relations are under the Leviathan, is entirely due to simply the exercise of human reason. Reason and reason alone is responsible for every step of this. That does not sound particularly pessimistic to me. In fact, it's kind of optimistic. If a violence were simply a part of human nature, there really would be nothing we could do about it. But if violence is the result of a particular situation that people find themselves in that might reward violence, then you should expect people to use violence. And so if you want to do something about it, you change the conditions under which people exist. The other thing I really wanted to mention here is that Hobbes here makes a kind of testable prediction. Right? The prediction is this: that if the Leviathan, that is a power that can hold people in common, a government, in other words, if a government really would make relations among people more peaceful by pacifying them, by sort of giving them incentives to choose peace, by punishing any who choose violence, who transgress this promise that they've implicitly made to let the Leviathan enforce a monopoly on violence, then generally speaking, as governments have gotten much larger, much more powerful, and much more well organized over time, over the last several hundred years, that we should expect to see the rates of violence among people in societies decrease, and really decrease a lot, because governments really have gotten lots more powerful and lots more well organized over the long view. Well, actually, they do. Right? We see, no matter how you look at it, whatever stats you take a look at, you'll notice that the world is way, way, way less violent now than it was, 50 years ago. It's far less violent than it was 100 years ago, and extremely less violent than it was 500 years ago, and unbelievably less violent than it was thousands of years ago. And a lot of that has to do with the rise of something like leviathans. Leviathans really are sort of proven to be a really excellent engine for peace. If you want a much larger and more lengthy description of some of these processes and others that have resulted in us living in the most peaceable time in human history, you should look up a book called "The Better Angels of Our Nature." The title is derived from a quote by Abraham Lincoln. The book itself is by a Harvard scientist by the name of Steven Pinker. That's Pinker. Hobbes, of course, is the first to print a social contract, but there are other famous social contract theorists out there. One of those is one written by a Frenchman named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He proposed a much more optimistic, if much less realistic, version of the social contract in 1762. His notion was that in the state of nature, everybody's actually peaceful, harmonious, and does fine, and that the only reason they sort of come together is because they need to reproduce somehow, or they can't really get everything that they want without some sort of cooperation. There's some amount of this that makes sense. Certainly, the cooperation angle is important, right, to humanity as a species, and cooperation is a rational reason, a rational basis for choosing to come together. But it's a very much a sort of a romanticism of sort of life without a government that I think actual history has really cast a lot of doubt upon. But it is a very famous version of the social contract. Another very famous social contract, one that actually has a great deal of historical importance, is the one belonging to this fellow here, John Locke, who we've certainly seen before in other capacities. He published a very important work called The Second Treatise on Government in 1690. Very easy book to read. It's rather short. It's very well organized. The paragraphs are numbered. It goes in a very logical order. Locke was a really excellent writer. So a lot of times people really, they really enjoy it. They read it. They say, "Wow, it makes so much sense. It's so, so commonsensical and precise and all that stuff." And it is all those things. And then people will ask me sometimes, what about the first treatise on government? Sort of assuming it to be something like a two-volume set. Well, if you look for the first treatise on government, you won't find it. The story is that Locke wrote a first treatise on government and kind of lost it, or a draft was destroyed, or something. I'm not entirely clear as to what exactly happened there. But the second treatise on government, it's more like treatise on government 2.0, and like 1.0 was never really published or available or anything like that. And so there is just the one major political work here that gets famous. And as you'll see, it was very heavily influenced by Hobbes. Locke will, in fact, use the very same formula that all social contract thinkers use and have used since Hobbes, right? It's going to use Hobbes's formula, and it's going to take a lot of Hobbes's ideas and sort of repackage them ever so slightly in some ways. And so, true to form, we're going to be following the pattern, and the first step in any social contract theory is to imagine life without government. So, to imagine a state of nature. And so Locke's state of nature is a little bit different than Hobbes's. It's imagined a little bit differently. And as far as I can tell, the only reason it seems to be terribly different is because of how he starts out imagining the state of nature. For whatever reason, Hobbes imagined the state of nature as single persons wandering around individually, right, in isolation. And that was the way that he approached that particular thought experiment. Whereas Locke is going to start thinking about the state of nature by thinking of a whole group of people already living together, some sort of community. It's just that this community in the state of nature doesn't have a government. They don't have a set of formal rules or anything like that. And so what is life like in Locke's state of nature? Right? What are things like? Well, again, let's think along with him. Just imagine what things really would be like. The whole point of a thought experiment is to say, or to really let it run. So just imagine there's a whole group of people. You take, say, our entire class and run them out to the countryside and say, okay, here you go. Here's this place. It's all yours. Figure out how to live amongst yourselves. Okay, that's pretty much what Locke imagines. And of course, in any community, there would have to be some pretty obvious rules. And whenever I do this in a face-to-face course, you just sort of ask, right? What kind of rules would you set out? Just sort of expect that everybody would. It almost goes without saying, like everyone would follow these rules, even if nobody had to say so. But that somebody would say, "Okay, everybody, some obvious rules here. What are they?" Now, of course, like I said, some of these are really obvious. So no killing. Okay, everyone's really okay with that. You're not allowed to kill anybody because you can't live with people if they're going to kill other people. You just can't do it. You can't be part of you can't be part of a community if you kill people. So that's a pretty obvious rule. Everybody acknowledges that one. Again, even if there's no government to tell you so, nobody likes that, right? It's pretty obvious. Second thing is you just say, okay, look, in general, the way that you deal with other people is you just don't mess with them, right? Don't interfere with them, as long as they're not hurting you or anybody else. Right? It's sort of a maximally live and let live kind of a way of going about things. And that would be the kind of default. That's the way that most people would respond to other people and say, well, you do what you want as long as you're not hurting anybody else. And of course, you don't steal things, right? You sort of keep to yourself, you respect other people's property, other people's space, and everything like that. And notice these three actions are pretty closely related. They all have to do with sort of granting everybody just a basic amount of respect that everybody expects from everybody else. And so these are the kind of rules that any community of persons, even without a government, would expect of each other. Locke says that's just plain common sense. And so, because these are the kind of rules that would occur even in the state of nature, that is, even without a government, Locke calls these rules. He calls it the natural law, and he says that's what reigns in the state of nature is natural law. That's natural state of nature. That's the naming convention there. Now, because natural law applies in the state of nature, people have these corresponding rights. So, for example, if nobody is allowed to kill anybody, then everybody has a right to life. If nobody's allowed to interfere with other people, then everybody has a right to liberty. And if nobody's allowed to steal, then everybody has a right to property. Okay, that's the way that rights and rules go along with each other. You don't have a right unless everybody is bound by some rule. And so these are then what Locke calls his natural rights, because they come from natural law, which is the law in the state of nature. Right? That's where we get these phrases from. And so our natural rights are life, liberty, and property in Locke's system. Remember that phrase. It'll come up later. It's very important. Now, of course, you think to yourself, that doesn't seem to be so bad. The state of nature that Locke describes is certainly much better than what Hobbes describes. And why not just live there? Why not live without government? Why not live in the state of nature there? Natural law sounds okay to me. So do natural rights. The trouble that Locke points out with the state of nature is really pretty obvious, and you'll see a lot of similarity between what Locke points out and what Hobbes pointed out. And so this is sort of so important that I've gone ahead and just quoted Locke directly here. So in section 124, he says, "The great and chief end, meaning goal, therefore, of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property, to which in the state of nature there are many things wanting." That is lacking, right? And so notice he focuses on property. Remember, those three big natural rights are life, liberty, and property. The most important of them for Locke was property. And it's not like because he was some sort of raging materialist or something like that. It's that he thought that your life and your liberty were things that could properly be thought of as things that belong to you, right? And so if you protect property, that includes life and liberty, right? So he calls life, liberty, estates, possessions, all that stuff. He calls it all by the name property. And so, again, let's let him continue. First, there wants, that is, he says there needs to be, an established, settled, known law, received and allowed by common consent to be the standard of right and wrong, and the common measure to decide all controversies between them. For though the law of nature be plain and intelligible to all rational creatures, yet men being biased by their interest as well as ignorant for want of study of it, are not apt to allow of it as a law binding to them in the application of it to their particular cases. Right? You have to slow down and read that a little bit. The English is several hundred years old here. But the big key phrase here is about people being biased by their own interest. The idea is, he says, look, it's obvious that everybody says, oh, yeah, no killing, no interfering with everybody else, no stealing, none of that stuff, right? The law of nature is pretty obvious to everybody. But what's not as obvious is how the law of nature applies to you as opposed to everybody else. And everybody has very different ideas about this. They have very different ideas about what the rules are when they apply to them and what the rules are when they apply to other people. Just watch a bunch of 6-year-olds try and play a board game of some kind, and you can just see this, right? Everybody has a different idea of the rules as applies to them and the rules that apply to everybody else, right? You know, they really don't sort of seem like they think they're playing the same game by the same rules. And so this is one of the things he points out. He says this self-interest, right, this bias that people have in favor of themselves is really what ruins the state of nature for everybody. And he thinks this is just a part of human nature. And it's a part of human nature that you require something to counteract, something to get around. And that's going to largely be the role of government. So this passage actually continues into sections 125 and 126. And he says, secondly, in the state of nature, there wants, that is, there needs to be, a known and indifferent judge with authority to determine all differences according to the established law. For everyone in that state being both judge and executioner of the law of nature, men being partial to themselves, passion and revenge is very apt to carry them too far, and with too much heat in their own cases, as well as negligence and unconcernedness to make them too remiss in other men's. And so the previous section said that there has to be a set of rules that everybody has to follow, and the set of rules has to be made impartially, that is, without favoring any one person over another. Because if people make their own rules, they make the rules that favor them and not anybody else. And then everybody follows only their own rules, and things devolve from there. Section 125 talks about interpreting all these rules and having somebody judge between disagreements about them. You have to have somebody to adjudicate all these disagreements because people can't be judges of their own cases. In fact, this is almost a direct quote from Hobbes. Hobbes had one of his laws of nature, or sort of laws of a proper commonwealth, was that nobody should ever be allowed to be a judge in their own case. And that thinking certainly influenced most of English jurisprudence and political thought, certainly influenced Locke, who certainly influenced early Americans. Section 126 continues, thirdly, in the state of nature, there often wants power to back and support the sentence when right and give it due execution. They who by any injustice offended will seldom fail, where they are able, by force to make good their injustice. Such resistance many times makes the punishment dangerous and frequently destructive to those who attempt it. In other words, right, in more modern English, if somebody's going to be bad enough to take advantage of other people by force, they're not going to be so good as to submit to punishment by force. And taking on the role of punishing those who transgress the law is likely to be dangerous. And so again, we have to have some impartial way of doing this. Again, if you're going to be enforcing the rules in your own case, you're likely to go way too far when you're enforcing things on your own behalf, and not far enough when you're enforcing the rules on behalf of somebody else. And so these are core functions of a government that are simply lacking in the state of nature. Now, again, I want to draw your attention to a couple of these really key phrases. Again, it is self-serving bias that people have that really ruins the state of nature for everybody, and then requires a government to help us get past or to counteract. So while we're on the topic of self-serving biases, I think it's worth pointing out the extent to which we know that these are in fact an aspect of human nature. I mean, it's pretty obvious, but it's also been sort of clinically proven. I wanted to give you some examples of the kinds of self-serving biases that Locke certainly would have noticed in his own day. One of these is what we call these days the Lake Wobegon effect, right after a famous Garrison Keillor is a public radio host who had these stories from this fictitious place called Lake Wobegon, where all the men are good looking and all the women are strong and all of the children are above average, and that's the place where they get this the Lake Wobegon effect, this notion of everybody being above average. And this is true of people. People tend to believe that they are above average in most desirable characteristics. So, for example, one survey of a million high school students, 25% of them believed that they were in the top 1%, right? People sort of tend to believe that they are much better than average. Ask anybody, and they're a better car driver than the average person is. And of course, that can't be true, right? Only half of them can be better than average, and many more than half believe that they are. And of course, most people think they're better than average where undesirable characteristics are concerned too. Most people think that they're much better tippers than the average, right? That they're much less cheap than the average person. And of course, only half of them actually can be. And so, despite the fact that we sort of know about these numbers, people just tend to put themselves in the upper category of like every characteristic that you can imagine, right? These are again self-serving biases. In addition to that, people undergo what's called self-serving assessment. So, for example, people do buy lottery tickets, right? You ask a whole room of people, how many ever bought a lottery ticket? Almost everyone's hand goes up. But if you ask, how many of you have put away even $1, right, for cancer treatment for yourself in the future? Nobody's hand goes up. Nobody's put away even $1 for cancer treatments, even though they know that they are far more likely to get cancer than they are to win the lottery. And it's the same bet, right? The idea is by betting $1 on a lottery ticket, betting $1 on not getting cancer. One of those is a pretty good bet, the other is not a very good bet, and yet people will make the one and not the other. And the reason for this is that people are able to imagine really good things happening to them, but seem unable or unwilling to imagine bad things happening to them, even when you ask them, they know that some of those bad things are much more likely. And so, again, we have this rose-colored view of our own futures that doesn't really match reality. And that does spoil things for us. It leads to people making honestly bad decisions, like, for example, buying lottery tickets. Also, if you ask a bunch of students, again, survey students, they tend to think of their good performance on a test as evidence that they're good students, right? That they're performing well, that they're the evidence of real achievement. And if they do badly on a test, they tend to think of that as evidence that the test is unfair, right? You'll see the problem. You see this a lot with athletes, right? When they win, it's because they're really good. When they lose, it's because of the refs. Okay, same story here. But, not to keep things on one side of the podium, teachers tend to attribute student success to their skill as teachers, and then attribute student failure to a lack of ability or effort on the part of the student. Right? Again, all of these are self-serving assessments. Right? They say, here's how likely something is to happen to me, or here's how good I am at this or that, or here's what the evidence says about me. And of course, when you look at it in a more sober light, a lot of that looks totally inaccurate. Again, these are the kinds of things people don't really notice until they really take the time to stop and notice them, and even then, they're pretty insidious. And so, one of the things that I want to take some time to look at here, it is mentioned in the text, but that is some of the parallels between Locke's writing and sort of early American political thought, because in a lot of ways, Locke was the official philosopher of the American Revolution. And so, again, it's one thing to say, oh, hey, look, there's a lot of real strong parallels between the Declaration of Independence and John Locke, or to say, okay, here's one document than the other. But it's really something else to kind of put them side by side and take a look at them. And so some of these slides I'll sort of skip through pretty quickly. Other ones I'll spend a little bit more time on. I'm certainly not going to read them all word for word. You can simply download the notes and read them next to each other for that. The first thing is to take a look at this notion of natural law, right? So again, in Locke in 1690 talks about people are free to do whatever they want in the state of nature, and the only bounds on their freedom in the state of nature are limits set by the law of nature, right? So, which is the law of equality. And this is the place where the writer of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, who was very heavily influenced by Locke, this is also where he started from. He talked about the separate and equal status that everybody has, to which the laws of nature, again, that's just natural law, and of nature's God entitle them, right? So they both have this concept of natural law and natural freedom. And so here's the famous paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now remember that phrase, the pursuit of happiness. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But Locke here says the state of nature is governed by a law that creates obligations for everyone. And reason, which is that law, teaches anyone who takes the trouble to consult it that because we are all equal and independent, no one ought to harm anyone else in their life, health, liberty, or possessions. This is because we are all the work of one omnipotent and infinitely wise Maker. So again, they both appeal to this natural equality, and they appeal to basic common sense with the way that people are supposed to treat each other. That is, because natural law applies even without a government, natural rights apply even without a government. And so the purpose of government for Locke is to preserve those natural rights in the face of all of these self-serving biases that would ruin the whole society if we just let people make their own rules. So the whole point of having a government for Locke is, as he states it, right, that in the state of nature, right, every man is equal. Most men are not strict observers of fairness and justice. So his hold on the property, that is your life and your liberty included, he has in the natural state is very unsafe. This makes him willing to leave a state in which he is very free, but which is full of fears and continual dangers, and he looks for others with whom he can enter into a society for the mutual preservation of their lives, liberties, and estates, which I call by the general name property. So the great and chief purpose of people uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. And of course, this gets abbreviated in the Declaration of Independence. It says to secure these rights, which were mentioned as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Notice, again, that phrase we'll get back to. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Right? That's the view that both Jefferson and Locke have, or that Locke has and that Jefferson repeats in the Declaration of Independence. Now, of course, the Declaration of Independence came along with a actual political rebellion, and I do enjoy the couple of paragraphs here about the causes for rebellion, because again, the parallelism is quite striking. So you can, if you, this is one I'm not going to read word for word, but I would encourage you to sort of read these in the notes here, read the left, read the right, even pause the video and go ahead and just read them now. But you can see there's a lot of parallel here in what causes a rebellion. There's also parallels in terms of cautiousness in beginning a rebellion. Both Locke and Jefferson admit, right, that you don't just rebel against your government every time you're dissatisfied with it. In fact, you can put up with a lot. It's just that at a certain point, which is as they both describe, at some certain point, the it gets so bad that the people really have no choice but to establish for themselves a new government. The idea is if the original government was established by consent to begin with, or else it's unjust, that any new one would have to be established by consent. Any consent would have to sort of, sort of overtake the previous governmental structure. Now let's go back to that phrase that's so famous: the life, liberty, and especially the pursuit of happiness. And this is again just an aside. If you look at the Constitution, which is very, again, strongly influenced by Locke's political writings and his political thought, you'll see a couple of interesting things. For example, if you look in the Fifth Amendment, this is part of the original Bill of Rights. It says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Now, of course, the actual amendment is a little longer than that, but that's the relevant piece there. It says life, liberty, property. Right? Again, Locke's three natural rights. And then again in the 14th Amendment, these are some of the immediate sort of post Civil War, sort of post emancipation rights that are added to the Constitution. It says, no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So it included, which is not only, in the government can't do it, but no state can do it either. But notice again, life, liberty, property. In fact, the number of times the phrase the pursuit of happiness occurs in the Constitution is precisely zero. Notice the Declaration of Independence is a letter, right? It's a public document. It's not a law, right? We don't, and there's nothing legally binding about the Declaration of Independence, right? It was just a letter. It says, hey, we're independent now. I mean, the actual law of the land is in the Constitution and in the U.S. Code, right? The Declaration of Independence is not part of U.S. law, but it is an historically important document. So here's the thing about that. If I there's a lot of formulas that people sort of recognize in terms of words that often get put together. So if I were to say, you're on a quest for truth, justice, and you probably hear it in your head, and the American way, right, from the old Superman television show, right? It's just part of, it's a common stock phrase that people use, and even if people don't necessarily remember it, they sort of remember its source anyway. They remember the claim. A little bit like some of Shakespeare's famous lines. It says, "To be or not," you finish out, "or not to be," right? That is the question, etc. Right? You don't when you say that you don't say, "Oh, by the way, Shakespeare said that," right? I mean, it's common knowledge, right? It's a common quote. It's a common formula of language. Well, look, among educated, politically aware British citizens, which were the early American founding fathers, uh, awareness of Locke and his political thought was pretty standard, right? Lots of people knew about Locke, lots of people knew what he wrote, knew what he said. And so this phrase, life, liberty, property, would have been a kind of stock phrase. People would have used that sort of formula fairly often, or at least known that it referred to Locke or Locke's ideas. Now, why then? So imagine now Jefferson is writing in this letter to the King of England. Uh, he says, look, we're what we're doing is we're looking after our natural rights, our life, our liberty, and our and something that starts with a P, and he says pursuit of happiness. Right now, everybody is hearing in their head, well, property, right? Just like if there's a car commercial that says, "Yes, we're on a quest for truth, justice, and the automobile of your dreams," right? You know that really they mean the American. They're doing a play on this common stock phrase, right? But what you think in your head, you think the American way, right? So just as that, any educated British person would have said, "Oh, life, liberty," and they would have thought property in their head, even though Jefferson said the pursuit of happiness. And of course, he meant property too. Most of the big issues of the American Rebellion were about taxation and resources and property, and the mercantile system, where that many of the upper classes of the colonies thought sort of made them dependent on England economically. And so, I mean, property was absolutely an issue. So why didn't Jefferson just say property? Well, here's the thing. It's supposed to be a letter. The rhetoric is supposed to be pretty lofty, and it was considered low class or crude for a gentleman to openly talk about money or to openly talk about defending his property. That was seen as a little crass, a little crude. And so, really, this phrase, "the pursuit of happiness," is a flowery sounding stand-in for property that allows Jefferson to not create a social faux pas. And it's become right this like the piece that everybody remembers. Oh, it's our pursuit of happiness. That's the thing that we really want. So it's very interesting. But again, it's really just a stand-in, and in fact, all the consequential documents say life, liberty, and property. So while we're on this topic of property, the text does go into this a bit, and they present Locke's theory of property, which is interesting and historically important. Again, his theory of property derives from some very common sense observations. In fact, the example that I typically use when I'm talking about Locke's theory of property is I say, just imagine you're in charge of a daycare for children. Okay, because it's just that common sense, right? That the thing that you sort of enforce for any group of children is sort of the same kind of thing that Locke points to in talking about property. And so remember, Locke has this social contract view. He imagines us in the state of nature and says, look, it's just obvious. Just any halfway reasonable person would tell you what the natural law is, what kinds of things people expect out of each other, even in the state of nature, even without a government to tell them so. And so his theory of property comes from this too. Remember, this is one of the three natural rights is okay, so what actually counts as somebody's property? How does somebody have property in a state of nature with no laws about ownership or things like that? Well, here's how he puts it. And so, okay, imagine you're running a daycare, and one of the children takes one of the toys, say a toy truck or something like that, and starts just rolling around, minding their own business and playing with it. Now, the idea is in a daycare, right? Imagine like all the toys really, they belong to the daycare. They don't actually belong to any of the individual children. They're just there for the children to use while they're there. It's common among many daycares. And so, one child comes in, and they sort of say, "Oh, hey, it's the toy truck. I really like the toy truck." So they start rolling it around and, making noises, whatever children do to play with toy trucks. And another child comes along, just sort of takes the truck away from them. Says, "Ah, I want the truck." Right now, you have something like the animation over the right, which is some kind of clip art or something like that. So, as the responsible adult, what do you do? Well, I think the response is pretty obvious. You tell the one who took the truck and say, "Hey, leave that alone. This kid, he had it first, so there it is." And in fact, that's just pretty much exactly what Locke says about how things become property. He says, whatever somebody usefully alters from its natural state is rightfully their property. The idea he gives this example of when you're walking around outside and you pick up some acorns off the ground. When do they become yours? Is it after you eat them, after you boil them? He's like, no, after you pick them up, somebody comes and knocks them out of your hand or something like that. No, all of a sudden that's a kind of offense. That's an affront. It's something that they've disrespected. The idea is you spent at least some labor picking them up off the ground. It is altering from their natural state. When they're just lying on the ground, they don't belong to anybody. Just like the truck, when it's just sitting on the floor in the middle of the daycare center, doesn't properly belong to anybody. But as soon as somebody starts to make use of it, well, they have some claim over it. Right? And that's the central intuition behind Locke's theory of property. But of course, it doesn't stop there. You have to add a couple of provisos. And so now imagine that in the daycare, you've got no toys at all, except for one PlayStation with one controller, and you've got a whole bunch of kids. Well, as the responsible adult, what are you going to have to do? Is it just going to be whoever gets there first gets the PlayStation, everybody else is out of luck? Mm, that's going to be a recipe for disaster. And so instead, you've got to ration it out. You say, okay, it's nobody's, right? You either take it away completely and just sort of let them fend for themselves, say, okay, find something else to entertain yourselves. I don't want to deal with this. Or you simply say, okay, everyone gets, but of course, that's not the best solution because then nobody gets the benefit of the resource. The best solution is to say, okay, everyone gets equal benefit of the resource. Nobody gets to monopolize it. You put everybody on a timer. Everyone gets to play for a certain amount of time, right? And that's how that's how the system gets shared out. So that's again seems pretty common sense, and this is again much how Locke modifies his theory of property. In a sense, he says that as long as ownership of some of this property isn't problematic. And so imagine there's a well, for example, of drinking water in a place that doesn't have a lot of water. Are you going to let any single person claim ownership over the well as a society? Of course not. That would be detrimental to society at large. And so, for any critical resource or very scarce resource, we don't tend to recognize anybody's legitimate claim to ownership of it. So instead, we share it out. A third example should illustrate another piece of Locke's theory of property. So imagine that somebody does is they get all the toys and they just start to push them into a pile and then defend the pile, right? And they want all the toys, they want to play with them all, and all the other children are like, look, we just want one or two, we just want a toy, or and they go, no, 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 I'm playing with them all, right? And you can't say you can't play with them all. It's like, no, this is how I play with them all. I put them in a big pile and I guard the pile, something like that. So this is again, as a responsible adult, what do? You say, no, you can't. You can't just have everything for yourself. You can't use that much. So again, Locke puts a proviso on how much property people are willing to recognize. And he says nobody can have more than they can actually put to good use, right? You can claim all kinds of things. So in fact, in his language, he says, you might look at my theory and say, look, if we follow your theory, it looks like all I have to do is just take everything I want and then it's all mine. It's as long as I grab it. He says, no, that's not true. People won't recognize as legitimate your claim to ownership if you're claiming more than you can actually use. That seems true. And so those three bits, those three pieces, those three ideas form Locke's theory of property. And again, if they're formed from a basic kind of common sense about what kinds of things people are willing to accept, even without a government to tell them to. But here's something to notice about Locke's theory of property. It's pretty subversive. It was in his day, and it is even in ours. So in his day, certainly one of the many things that that was subversive about it is that it implied that it was the peasant farmers who rightfully owned all of the land that they worked and not all of the lords. You remember this is something of a feudal system at this time, where the people who own the land is technically the king. King owns all the land, and then the king sort of grants the land to various lords, grants rights to it to them, and those lords have people who live on the land who pay them to live on the land, and then they farm the land. They actually do the work that gives them the money to pay to work the land. So people are actually paying rent to farm the land that they live on and farm on, and then the proceeds from all that farming get sort of paid up to the lords who appear to be doing really nothing. And so again, this idea of owning something that you usefully alter from its natural state. Look, if you're doing all the work, planting and sowing and reaping, it seems like you own the land, not some landlord. And it also implies that the richest in any society are unjust, in the sense that they have more than they can put to good use. I saw a TED talk by one particular individual, and I misremember his name at the moment, but it wouldn't be too hard to find. He says, he says he's a plutocrat by any reasonable definition. That means a very, very wealthy person. And he says, if I have a bunch of extra money, he sort of like gestured his pants. He's like, I've, there's a really nice pair of pants. They, cost me, $80. Um, am I going to buy 100 of them? Right? If I have a bunch of extra money, well, of course not. Money's not really doing me that much good. I have more of it than a person could reasonably use, and so it doesn't do society a lot of good in my hands. And that's just kind of the way it is. So again, the richest in any society seem to have more than they can really put to good use, and so Locke's theory of property implies that we shouldn't recognize their claim to property over that much. So his theory is subversive even in our own time, and yet it seems to be derived from principles that are really quite commonsensical, even if it has some very difficult kinds of consequences. We're going to move on from some of these Enlightenment era concepts. This idea of the social contract as a great way of justifying a government, right? And we're going to start looking at some more modern versions of the social contract, specifically the kind of contract theory given by this fellow here, a fellow by the name of John Rawls. He was born in 1921 and died in 2002. He worked at Harvard for most of his career, and he's famous for this book about well, the book describes a theory of justice and is called a theory of justice. Philosophers are really excellent at naming things. So the first thing that Rawls wants us to do is wants us to imagine. This is parallel to Hobbes or Locke imagining a state of nature. What he wants to imagine is that people are approaching the question of what kind of moral code there should be or what kind of society we should have from what he calls the original position, also known as from behind the veil of ignorance. The idea is he talks about people choosing something or agreeing to something, and this is what makes his view a social contract view. So the idea is that we're supposed to all choose something from behind the veil of ignorance. Now, of course, what does that mean? So the veil of ignorance is a kind of nickname he gives to the original position. They both mean the same thing in his writing. And so behind the veil of ignorance, people are rational. Okay, they are self-interested. They care what happens to themselves, and they're ignorant of their particular endowments and their place in society. This is why he calls it the veil of ignorance, because it's a thing that prevents you from knowing something about yourself. So what we're supposed to do is imagine a bunch of people choosing a society or choosing a moral code without knowing anything about themselves, right? So when we talk about their particular endowments, we say that we don't know whether they're fast or slow, tall or short, male or female. They don't know what race they are. They don't know what their particular interests are. They don't know really anything in particular about themselves. They don't know whether they have a great sense of humor or not. And they also don't know their place in society, whether they're going to be rich, whether they're going to be poor, sort of who in society they're going to be. And so then Rawls proposes that from this very interesting sort of place, that the ideal society, the best one, the most just one, uh, the best society, the best moral code, is the one that everyone would agree to from behind the veil of ignorance. So if you get a bunch of rational and self interested people who don't know where they're going to be in any particular society, they don't know anything about themselves, everything that they would all agree to anyway is going to be the ideal society. And that's going to be a clue of how it would look. And the purpose of the veil here now is essentially to remove self serving bias. In fact, very much the thing that motivated John Locke to argue for the necessity of having a good government is because it takes out of all sorts of different people's hands the kinds of self-serving biases that they would naturally have otherwise. And so the purpose of not knowing anything about your particular endowments or place in society is so that you wouldn't then agree to something that might benefit you, but sort of wouldn't benefit somebody else. So if you don't know, for example, whether you were tall or short, you wouldn't support a society that really punished short people or really punished tall people because you're like, well, gosh, I wouldn't know if I was one of them. And so, for this reason, Rawls's theory is often called the sort of the blind taste test theory of justice, because a blind taste test itself is regarded as the most fair way of evaluating things against each other, of sort of comparing and contrasting things. And so, if you're having, tasting beverages or something like that, the reason you do a blind taste test is so that the packaging doesn't start to, mess with people's expectations, right? Because they can fool themselves into thinking that one thing is a little better than the other. And in a sense, once you remove all this bias, you remove a particular kind of error, then you can end up with a much fairer result. And that's pretty much the intuition that Rawls taps into here with his original position. So each of these social contract theories, or certainly the first two more than Rawls's, has a kind of a criticism that David Hume, who we've seen many times before, shoot holes in a lot of seemingly pretty good ideas. Uh, but Hume's criticism of the social contract is this, right? And I think that the text misconstrues it a little bit, and I'm a little irritated about that. So one of the things that the text says about Hume's criticism is that Hume says, look, there never was any actual state of nature, and there's no actual consent that happens. There's no actual contract. Look, Locke and Hobbes completely agree, right? Hobbes and Locke said, look, no, there never was an actual historical period that there was a state of nature. There's not actually a document that everybody has to sign as soon as they're born, or whatever. No, I mean they say it's a kind of abstraction. It says the whole point of government is to be the kind of thing, right, that people would agree to, that reasonable people would agree to, given the kinds of challenges that they would face without it. Right? Again, the state of nature thing is a thought experiment to try and show what's really important about government, to make sure government is that way, right? That it solves the kind of problems it's intended to exist in order to solve. So that's not really Hume's criticism. He does say that, right? But that's not really the heart of his criticism. The heart of Hume's criticism attacks one of the central assumptions of certainly Hobbes's and Locke's social contract, more Locke's than anybody's, is that consent itself is really irrelevant. Now, to some extent, uh, Hobbes's view is compatible with Hume's criticism, but Locke's much less so. And so here's Hume's argument for consent really being irrelevant, sort of in a nutshell. If you're really interested, you can just Google Hume of the original contract, and you'll find any number of places that just show you the whole original document. You can read over it, and again, Hume's writing style is beautiful, and the piece is entertaining and interesting. And so first off, he just points out, he says, look, just ask anybody, right? Go all over the world, ask everybody, why do you follow the laws of the government under which you live, right? Or what gives the government the right to tell you what to do, right? Something like that. Ask something like that second question, and they'll be like, they're the government. I was just born here, of course I have to follow the rules. And so really nobody imagines that they have any choice but to live under governments, right? They're born under governments. That's their parents were born under governments. Their grandparents were born under governments, right? That's just the way it is. And so, when you say now, what gives them the right? You say, what do you mean? What gives? They're the government. It's just the way it is. Okay, so really, nobody imagines they have any choice but to live under government. Now, of course, maybe everybody's wrong about that, right? Maybe they really do have a choice. Maybe governments really are all only there because of some kind of implicit or implied consent. But Hume pushes the criticism further. He says, actually, when you ask people, nobody really thinks that they ought to have a choice, right? That governments don't require, or shouldn't even require their consent. So again, imagine this, right? Imagine you get pulled over for speeding, right? And you tell the police officer who's issuing you the citation, you say, well, look, officer, nobody asked me what the speed limit should be, right? I never agreed to this. What would you want the police officer to say in this case? I mean, I think it occurs to all of us to say we should want the police officer, this representative of the state, to say, nobody has to ask you. You don't have to weigh in on this. You don't have to agree to it. It's the law, and that's the way it is. You have to follow it. And so, same thing with paying taxes. People are like, well, nobody asked me if I wanted to pay taxes. Well, they shouldn't have to, right? It just isn't up to you, and it shouldn't be up to you. If it were up to everybody, nobody'd pay taxes. We wouldn't have any roads. We wouldn't have any cops. We wouldn't have a country. So that's the idea that there's a certain amount of this that everybody just recognizes has to be involuntary because otherwise nobody would choose to do it, and that's a really interesting thing. So it's uh, yeah, everyone recognizes that these things ought to be involuntary, and so in that sense, they agree with the social contract theorists. But there's that whole notion of it being involuntary that sort of goes against a lot of the way that these original contract theories are explained. And finally, those who do think so, those who do think that consent is all that in a bag of chips, are often rightfully punished, right? I mean, there's, for example, if you look at what's often called in many places sovereign citizen movements or things like that. These are people who say, look, I didn't ever sign some contract, or the government's abusive and tyrannical, and so I'm renouncing it, or I'm seceding from the government, and everybody else should too, right? If somebody says, look, The government has no right to charge me income tax, and so I'm not going to pay it, and I'm going to encourage other people not to pay it. What ought to happen to these people? Right? I think most people say, well, no, they ought to be punished. They ought to be fined. They ought to be jailed. They ought to be whatever for for so damaging the fabric of our society, for calling into question the basic rule of law. And so you'll notice that the rightfully punished piece of this is a hyperlink. So if you go into the notes, you'll see an article of one of the more ridiculous cases of somebody deciding that the laws don't really apply to them. So enjoy. It's from the Legal Humor blog, Lowering the Bar. And so I know I'm doing this a little bit out of order from what the text does, but it actually fits here a little better than it fits where the text puts it. And that's to start talking about the political philosophy of John Stuart Mill, or at least his theory of justice. He wrote a couple of really important books to both ethics and political philosophy. One of them called Utilitarianism, which has a big chapter on justice, published that in 1861. And he published the book On Liberty in 1859. And his view about morality and about all issues of public policy is very famously misquoted as advocating the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, he used some formulations that sound a little bit like that, but really it creates a lot of wrong impressions, and so I want to sort of step on that one right away. His view is right that he's a consequentialist. Right, this is that what makes something just or unjust, right or wrong, good or bad, is what consequences it has. And so his view is that whatever available act, right, you could do this, you could do that, whatever act that's available to you produces the best overall consequences. And he defines those consequences in terms of pleasures and pains, right? Those are things you can actually sort of quantify and point to and say, yes, that pleasures are good, and we experience them in many different varieties. Pains are bad, and there are lots of different kinds of pains. And if you want to say, what's so good about pleasure? He'll say, look, have you tried it? Right? It doesn't seem like there's any it doesn't seem like it needs any justification. Same thing with saying, what's wrong with pain? It doesn't seem like it needs any justification for being bad. And so that's why he uses pleasures and pains, right? Thinks it's pretty obvious and something you can ground a theory of morality or justice in. And so whatever act produces the greatest total amount of pleasure, right? Added all up among all of the people affected, is the right one, and anything that produces less than the best is the wrong one. Okay, you want the best consequences that are available. And so this is one of the ways that this often gets misunderstood is people say, oh yeah, utilitarianism, which is John Stuart Mill's view, is says that 51 people can just kill 49 people if they don't like them, and utilitarianism says that's the right thing to do because there's more of the one than the other. And that's really not true. The idea is, again, you have to add up all of the consequences. And you have to say, okay, so is there an act available that would produce more total pleasure than 51 people killing 49? Well, I can think of at least one. How about 51 people not killing the 49? That probably would produce a greater total amount of pleasure than pain, and certainly greater total amount of pleasure than certainly, than almost half of your population simply disappearing. And so, of course, then that's wrong to do that. It's wrong for 51 people to kill 49 because it's not the thing that produces the best overall consequence. And so the reason I put him here is because he shares something in common with Hume. And Hume was also, to some degree, a consequentialist about the nature of governments. And so Mill and Hume both held this view that the value of government was in its practical consequences. It's in what it actually does for us, not in the ideology behind its founding. Right? It doesn't require this necessarily consent, or it doesn't require everybody to agree on why we should have a government, but it should do the things that governments do. That is, keep the peace, right? And punish wrongdoers, uphold the law, be impartial, correct people's self-serving biases, right? These are all important functions of governments. And as long as a government does those things, it doesn't really matter so much why people think they have one. And that's a view that's common to both Mill and to Hume. And so that's why I've gone ahead and put him here. The second family of views of justice we'll take a look at here have to do with the views that get into economic justice, or sometimes also called distributive justice. This is the kind of justice that has to do with how resources are divided up in a society, because all societies do have resources, and they all must make decisions about how those resources are most fairly or justly divided. So we'll look at some of these theories, but before doing so, we're going to have to clarify some key terms. So I think the text is a little bit sloppy with a few of these terms here, and so I wanted to provide a little bit more precise definitions of some of them to head off possible misunderstandings. So one of the first terms that they define is a term called liberalism, right? Now, what they mean here is classical liberalism. Okay, this is this kind of Enlightenment era philosophy, right? This is a couple of hundred years ago. People were liberals in this classic sense, and pretty much all of Western political thought belongs to the classical liberal tradition. Okay, and so it's not the same thing at all as what we say today when we talk about liberals versus conservatives or something like that. So it's not at all the same thing. Yes, it's the same word, not the same concept. So don't be confused. Don't equate one with the other. They're just two different words that are sometimes applied to the to this different views. The same word applied to different views. So on with the definition. Okay, so they give a kind of definition of capitalism. It's really generic, very very broad. We can do a little bit better. So I've actually enlisted the assistance for this most of this next section uh, of, of of a fellow by the name of Richard DeGeorge. Richard DeGeorge has written a whole number of things, including one really excellent book of business ethics. Actually, a lot of people credit Dr. DeGeorge with inventing business ethics as a field of study. He worked at the University of Kansas for a great period of time. Is still associated with the University of Kansas, although is mostly retired these days. Although he's still working, still keeping active, and is quite lively. I actually just ran into him in the grocery store a few days ago. So Dr. DeGeorge has a number of writings, and in his very excellent book on business ethics, he has some sections on economic models. And so I'm going to be using a lot of his approach here because I think it's very sensible. I think it's precise. And I think it'll help us to get a better, clearer idea of all this stuff here. So here's how Richard DeGeorge defines capitalism. And again, I think it's a very good definition. It's a very broad definition. I think a lot of people can agree with this one in most particulars. Capitalism is a combination between three different things. The first of which is that it requires an available accumulation of industrial capital, right? So capital as in resources to do industrial stuff. Okay, so again, capitalism is an industrial economic system, not an agricultural economic system or anything like that. So pre-industrial economic systems could not properly be described as capitalist. Right? So that's the first thing. The second thing that capitalism requires is a private ownership, or at least largely private ownership of the means of production. That is, factories, factory buildings, natural resources, mines, stuff like that is owned by individuals or collections of individuals operating under their own cognizance, and instead of as this is as opposed to public ownership or social ownership, right? That is owned by a government or owned by society at large. Okay, it's private ownership and also a market economy. That is, that the economy uses markets, or sometimes people call it a free market system. That's what they mean. So capitalism is these three things. It involves an available accumulation of industrial capital, private ownership of the means of production, and a market economy. Now, capitalism is an economic system, right? The word capitalism applies to economics, and people often get this confused. They talk about various kinds of policies as being capitalism, and that's not accurate. Policies are policies, right? And so there are lots of political approaches to capitalism. So there are a lot of ways for governments to have policies toward the economies in their countries, right? But capitalism is all by itself not a political system, it is an economic system. And so political systems that might be associated with capitalism include all kinds of different forms. Right, so governments could take all kinds of different models to try and incorporate capitalism as part of the overall political system. Right? The idea is that they'll have policies toward their economic system. And again, this comes from Dr. DeGeorge's book. So one of the possible models would be what's known as the laissez-faire model, right? This is the sort of maximally anarchistic, the government only keeps the peace and adjudicates disputes. That's all that they're there for. Now, of course, there is no such thing as capitalism in the absence of any political organization. Because in the absence of any political organization, you don't have economies at all. You can't even have an economic system. So imagine what you have in the absence of government, you have the state of nature, right? That means people do whatever they want. You can't have a market under those conditions at all. And so in order to have even have a market at all, you do have to have a government, okay? But the laissez-faire model says as little as possible, right? And of course, no actual nations are now or have ever really been laissez-faire models. I mean, some a little closer, some a little further, but none of them have ever really gone that far. Another possible thing that a government can do is they can take a stance of what's called industrial protectionism. That is the view that government exists to serve the interests of the owners of the means of production. Right? So that is that government laws ought to be all pro-ownership, sort of pro-business owner, right? And that the government should help business owners to succeed. Right? That's what we call industrial protectionism. And again, various elements of various governments over time have done this to a greater and lesser extent. Right? Again, nobody's gone whole hog into this, being the only thing the government does, and all governments have had some kinds of laws that are somewhat industrial protectionist. So again, this is not sort of a pure on or off kind of a thing. Another thing that a government could do with respect to its to a capitalist system or economic system is what's called domestic protectionism, and this we're actually seeing a little bit more of these days. I'm recording this in the summer of 2018. And so government, this view says that government exists to protect the domestic economy from foreign competition. So, for example, you might say the government of Canada should really work to make sure that Canada's industries or Canada's businesses are doing better than the businesses of other countries, or at least that they're protected from competition by other countries. So instead of importing American cars, they ought to be making Canadian cars, right, or something like that. Now, here's the thing. If everybody makes their own cars, everybody actually does worse off because one of the great things about markets is they let people specialize. And so if everybody does what they do best, everybody benefits, even if there's some places that could do a certain thing even better. So it's the idea is that specialization really pays off a lot. And so domestic protectionism, if you ask pretty much any economist, is a bad idea, right? It ends up being sort of a false idea. But this is something that governments, to varying degrees, have occasionally done over time, some more than others. So the biggest tools of domestic protectionism are things like tariffs and import quotas and things like that, to say, oh well, look, if we want to if we want to import goods, we have to make them artificially expensive so that the goods that are produced here can sort of artificially compete. And what that does, it duplicates a lot of labor, and the overall system is much less efficient, and that means that things tend to just get more expensive and of lower quality. Right? But this is again, it's one possible way that people might respond, or might structure themselves with respect to a capitalist system. Not the wisest, but it is one that we've seen on and off here and there. Also, you might see a kind of correctionist model. That is, that the government exists to correct the excesses and deficiencies of the market. You might say that we have an economic system, and the whole purpose, the role of government within that economic system, is to try and say, here's some of the things that the market does too radically, or some of its worst impacts. For example, sometimes some kinds of markets tend toward monopolies, right? And if we don't want a monopoly, well, then the government's job is to break up that monopoly, or to prevent it from occurring, or to regulate it if it does occur, to make sure that it doesn't become abusive. Okay, so that's one kind of excess that a market might create. It also might create deficiencies, right? There might be all kinds of things that nobody really wants to do in a market that a government might have to step in and make sure that they still get done somehow, right? So the idea is to correct some deficiencies of the market. Right, that would be a correctionist procedure. And again, some governments do this to a greater extent than others. Pretty much all governments that have market systems engage in some version of correctionism, right? They regulate their markets at least to some reasonable extent. Another view would be something like cooperationism. Dr. DeGeorge points out that maybe the best example of this would be, say, for example, contemporary Japan. And the view of this kind of a philosophy says that government exists to help businesses that make the society better off. The idea is that it's sort of pro business so long as that business is also pro society, right? The idea is that government and business cooperate, hence cooperationism, in an effort to make society as good as it can be. And that's one kind of a model. And again, some element of this is probably present in all modern governments that have some kind of a market system, and more so in some than in others. And finally, you could have what could be called market socialism. And some people actually want to just call that socialism, and other people want to say, no, 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 it's kind of capitalist. And there's a really large gray area here, because again, there are not any purely socialist countries either, just like there aren't any purely capitalist countries in the sense of having nothing but a government that establishes a market and nothing more. And so, market socialism is the idea that the government exists to run things that markets do not run well, right? That is, markets are then allowed wherever they're beneficial. And look, to some degree, all governments do this, right? So a lot of people, for example, like to think of the United States as the ultimate of sort of capitalist experiments. But frankly, we don't have there's all kinds of places where the markets are barred, right? Where they're not allowed, and where the government simply runs things because markets would do a terrible job. So I'll just give you two examples. Number one would be law enforcement, right? Can you imagine a free market law enforcement system where you would have to sort of pay for your own police, right? So you have to hire them. Uh, just imagine it. Really, that would be more like a protection racket run by the mob than what we now think of as actual law enforcement. And it would be pretty awful. And so, because running law enforcement on a free market basis just wouldn't work at all, that's why the government runs it. Also, things like education, for example. Uh, there are certain elements of market that are involved in that, but in a sense, there's also this notion of widespread free education for everybody. Because again, if you leave that all up to the market, things get sort of way too unequal. And it's worth, right, having an expansive public education system. So even in the United States, we have these sorts of things. We don't let markets run everything, uh, and we let markets run, where they do the kinds of things that markets do well. So those are all different kinds of models of that political systems might take toward sort of modifying, governing, or working with some kind of capitalist economic system. As you can see, that's quite a lot of different things. And so, what I really hope is that you'll see this and you'll stop sort of saying like broad things like capitalism is like X or capitalism is like Y, or even capitalism is good or capitalism is bad. Those phrases are so broad and encompass so many possible things that they're basically meaningless. And so instead, you should get a little bit more specific as to what's going on when you're trying to sort of criticize one thing or another, or so and again realizing that the world is a little more complicated than that. So another important term here is what's often regarded as a kind of opposite to capitalism, and it's called socialism. And it's not really an opposite in a lot of ways. There are socialist elements in pretty much all modern states, and there are capitalist elements in pretty much all modern states. Again, there are a couple of notable exceptions here or there, but for the most part, everything's a kind of a mix. And so, again, we're defining socialism as being more of a pure socialism, even though we know that that doesn't actually exist anywhere. And so, our definition of socialism, again, derived from Dr. DeGeorge's business ethics text, uh, is that socialism is a combination of these three things: an industrial base. Again, socialism is an industrial economic system, right? Not a pre industrial one. Social ownership of the means of production. And that could take a variety of forms. That is, perhaps the state, the government that is, could own the means of production. The means of production could be owned by society at large in some way or another, or it could be owned by the employees, right? Even again, even in capitalist systems, across the world, there are plenty of employee-owned businesses, right? So if the primary or the main ownership of the means of production in some place is employee ownership, well, that counts as socialist, right? It's social ownership of the means of production. And then finally, socialism typically involves some form of centralized economic planning, so centralized planning of the economy. Now, again, all governments engage in some kinds of economic planning, right? The greater the degree that is done, the more accurate the label socialism is to that kind of a system, right? So again, socialism is not purely an economic system; it's a kind of political and economic hybrid. And so, for a socialist system, okay, there are lots of different political approaches, and just like there were to capitalism, and these primarily take a couple of different kinds of spectrums, right? So, number one, how much social ownership of the means of production? If it's very little, right, that would be a country that's not particularly socialist. If it's a whole lot, that's a country that's more socialistic, right? But of course, there are all kinds of different stages in between. How much social ownership of the means of production, and of course, then how much centralized planning. So some places do very little centralized planning, right, of their economies. Some of these aren't actually the very best of countries. Some do a lot more, and sometimes that doesn't work out very well. Again, both ends of the spectrum have their definite drawbacks. For example, the former Soviet Union was very much on the other side of this. It had lots and lots and lots of centralized planning. In fact, almost everything was centrally planned. They didn't really want to leave anything to markets. And so as a result, they had all kinds of surpluses of things and shortages of things, and distribution of goods and services was always problematic. If you ask people who lived in the former Soviet Union, they'll tell you they really got used to standing in line for things, because it was kind of a mess in a lot of ways. You can hear a lot of often sort of tragic and sometimes even funny stories about some of the snafus involved in that kind of centralized planning. But of course, most places are somewhere in between the no planning and all planning areas, some much sort of more extensively planned than others. Which brings us to the ideological origins of what we call socialism and, in some other ways, communism. I wouldn't necessarily conflate the two, and I'm not going to spend any time trying to describe the specific distinctions or whatever, because again, they're both rather nebulous terms. Just suffice it to say that. But this here is a photograph of Karl Marx. He was a German thinker, and he published his big famous book called Das Kapital. It is very long. He published it in 1867. And it has really inspired over a century of discussion and even political revolution in a lot of places over issues of what we call economic justice, over issues of whether a particular system is economically fair to the people who live in it. And of course, no relation between Karl Marx here and the famous comedians, the Marx Brothers. So one of the things that's very important, and this is one of the things that the text very much focuses on, is they focus on a lot of the situation that Marx and Frederick Engels are writing in response to, and that's this context of the early Industrial Revolution. The early days of the Industrial Revolution indeed did contain examples of child labor, exploitation, very poor worker safety, and a lot of excessive social stratification. That is, that some people got fabulously filthy rich and other people were just desperately, desperately poor. And what was worse is that a lot of the super rich got that way simply by taking advantage of the poor and making their lives worse. And it did happen. It does happen still to some degree today, but most of the very worst examples of these sorts of things were absolutely elements of the early Industrial Revolution. And so In a context where those sorts of things really are happening, you can imagine people getting pretty agitated about those sorts of things and speaking out against them. To a large degree, these are all things that governments and societies have taken great steps to try and eradicate, and to some reasonable degree of success in most cases. And the other thing that Marx does often get sort of criticized for is that sort of up through the early is that he advocated a lot of really violent revolution, right? He thought it was inevitable that all of this conflict between the classes, the conflict between slaves and masters, between serfs and lords, between sort of wage workers and factory owners, all of these things. He thought all of this conflict was just bound to get bloody at some point. It was inevitable, and so you may as well just embrace it, rush it along because you can't do anything about it, etc. So all of these things, these are things that Marx gets criticized for sort of advocating all this bloody strife and revolution, much of which put add a lot of chaos to the world and a lot of destruction. But again, let's put this in its historical context. In his time, up through really the early 20th century, most social change was the result of violent struggle. And there are some notable exceptions, and most of those are a lot more recent. Uh, in more recent times, so for example, post World War II, we've seen a lot of extreme, very, very successful social movements that were entirely or largely peaceful, right? That were largely the result of rational argument and certain kinds of advocacy, right, and demonstration, protest, those sorts of things that really have lasting and major effects. Um, and those sorts of things are kind of new in human history when you really sort of take a look at the whole long scope of things. So again, the couple of criticisms that we often have of Marx, so Marx has all these doom and gloom predictions about how bad that capitalism just inevitably is, and of course today workers tend to be much safer than they used to be. Child labor in most parts of the world is no more. There's exploitation is condemned generally wherever people find it. That's not controversial, and there's all this progress in short. And so we say, well, boy, Marx was sure full of it. But honestly, without Marx and other people noticing all of those problems and saying how problematic they were, we probably wouldn't have made that kind of progress. And again, much of that progress has been the result of collective bargaining, collective organization, people banding together, people making their voices heard, going on strike, doing various things like that, which generally don't turn to violence. So a lot of our progress has not necessarily been violent, especially recently. And so again, these are things where Marx, as a matter of history, kind of got it wrong. However, one of the things I do wish the text had spent more time developing were the arguments that Marxists made, because they're kind of interesting. And a lot of people want to say, oh boy, look how well the Soviet Union worked. That shows how smart Marx was. Well, look, the Soviet Union was not particularly Marxist. I mean, they were sort of inspired by Marx, but they certainly didn't do any of the kinds of things that Marx actually advocated. They were a really sort of repressive totalitarian regime that made a hash of a lot of stuff, including the personal freedoms of their citizens and then the interests of their citizens. So it's worth actually going back to take a look at some of Marx's actual arguments because they're not moronic. And so it's worth actually understanding where people were actually coming from here. And there are many sort of Marxists and neo-Marxists and things like that around. And they're not morons. And so, for example, one of the arguments concerns patterns of distribution. Okay, and so imagine this. Imagine you have some number of pizzas and you have to divide it among some group and you want to do it fairly. Right. Well, there are several different patterns that you could use to distribute the pizza that would strike people as fair. One of them is just give everybody the same amount of pizza, right? That's one way to do it. And most people don't really have any great complaint with that. But another way of doing it, you might say, okay, let's say that you get a little bit more pizza if say it's a class pizza party, right? You get a little bit more pizza if you got some of the extra credit assignments, or if you got the best test score, you get a little sort of a bonus slice or something like that. So the idea is that there are some inequalities involved, as not everybody gets the same, but those that are there are due to some form of achievement. And again, people think, this might be perfectly fair to divide up the pizza this way, right? At least in some cases. Also, you might say, well, look, we've got all this pizza, and look, some people are really hungry, and some people are not very hungry, right? And so why not give more pizza to the people who are really hungry and less pizza to the people who aren't very hungry? Again, that doesn't seem unfair. That's not ridiculous. Uh, Another way of putting it is you want to say maybe it's a whole work crew, right? That they've all been working all day, and somebody orders a bunch of pizzas. And the idea is you might say, look, all the people who worked more hours are sort of entitled to more of the pizza, and the people who worked the fewer hours are entitled to less of it. Again, that's not moronic either. That seems fair in a sense. And so it's actually these last two, this need pattern and this labor pattern. Those are sorts of the things that Marxists argued for. They said that society shouldn't be, divvied up based on sort of where you were born, which is where a lot of it does. Instead, it should be how much you actually work or how much you actually need, right? And so there's a lot of that. Again, it's not moronic, right? It may not be the best in all circumstances, maybe we have to use different formulae depending on different contexts, but certainly the idea that you should apportion things based on those who work and apportion things based on needs, uh, you know, those are reasonable at least in some cases. And then his other argument is even more interesting and pretty subtle. And again, it's not moronic, although it may be mistaken. So he has this argument that said that all profit was basically exploitation of the workers. And here's how the argument goes. And so we're going to consider an example, an iPhone 7, 32 gigabyte. I know it's been a number of years since these were current. I just sort of picked something out of my hat. And just the numbers I'm giving you are just raw estimates. They're basically ballpark figures that I did a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of research to try and find out. So don't hold these numbers up to anything. Don't treat them as gospel truth. I really just needed an example, and this was as good as any. So again, it's just an example to illustrate the argument, but the numbers are, again, rough ballparks. All right, so the sale price of an iPhone 7 about 650 bucks. Now, out of that, you can do a little research and find out that the materials in an iPhone 7 cost about $220. Okay, that's the material. That's that blue slice of the pie. The manufacturing process that is putting all of those materials together. Again, most of that's done by robots, done pretty fast. And so that adds $5, right, to the actual product. It only costs about $5 to manufacture an iPhone once you've bought all the materials. Now, of course, that's not the only thing that Apple has to pay for. They have to advertise. Of course, Apple advertises an awful lot, but in the grand scheme of things, the advertising costs aren't, certainly they don't compare to the materials costs. And so, assume that's like $10. Okay, for each iPhone sold. Right? And of course, then there's R&D, there's research and development, because you have to have some way of, you know, continuing to make all these things, right? Somebody had to get paid to figure out that you at some point have to move the headphone jack from the top to the bottom or vice versa, right? Somebody has to be paid for these things. But yeah, the research and development's there. And just based on this idea that Apple typically spends 3% of their total earnings on research and development, let's take 3% of this. That's again, maybe $15, right, out of the total sale price here. So so what you add all that up, the materials cost, the manufacturing cost, the advertising cost, R&D, there's probably some other overhead in there somewhere. But the rest of it, notice that's more than half of it is profit. Okay, it's profit. It's extra money. And so a Marxist looks at this and says, "Come on, if all of those things, if the R&D requires somebody's labor, the advertising requires somebody's labor, the manufacturing process requires somebody's labor, and the materials, right, are all made by somebody or refined by somebody or dug out of the ground by somebody, etc., right? All of this stuff requires labor. They require people to actually do things for all that to be available. And if all of their labor put together generates something that is worth $650 on the market, then why aren't you dividing that $650 up among the people who actually generated the value, that actually did what was required in order to get this thing, this iPhone, to exist at all? And so if you're just keeping this big chunk of money as profit, what you're doing is you're just taking the value that is produced by all these other people. And that's the argument for profit being exploitation. Right? Again, it's not a stupid argument. In fact, it's kind of compelling. Many people have found it very compelling. So, despite the fact that his arguments are stupid, they're not necessarily ironclad either. No argument really is. I mean, everything has some room for criticism. Well, not everything, but most things. And so, one criticism of the labor theory of value, that is, that things should be apportioned based on how much people work, is that labor doesn't necessarily produce value, right? So, I'm going to use an illustration that's actually from a book by Robert Heinlein. The book is called Starship Troopers. If you've not seen the movie, this isn't in it. The book itself contains this illustration and a discussion of Marx's theory of value, of all things. And the illustration is something like this. Imagine you have some apples and some pastry dough. Those are things that are valuable in and of themselves. And one thing you could do is you could give them to my brother, who's not the world's most talented chef. He's good at a whole lot of things, but maybe cooking isn't among them. Uh, Perhaps getting better over time, but it's not his great specialty. Well, he could spend all day turning those ingredients into a blackened and inedible mess, right? He'd spend all day working really hard at it and end up with value zero, right? Value subtracted. Whereas a really talented pastry chef could whip up something fantastic with really, very little effort in the grand scheme of things, right? And so this idea that labor alone doesn't really produce value, and so there might be lots of circumstances in which apportioning society's resources just based on the amount of work people do, maybe that doesn't make as much sense as all that. And another argument, the argument toward his second, his argument about the profit being exploitation, again, there might be a mistake made in there. So one of the interesting things about trade is that it's a positive sum game, right? That there's always a synergy involved. That is, there's more value than the sum of the total parts. And actually, it's a sort of a hallmark of a sort of primitive or bad economic thinking for people to think there's only so much money out there, right? And anything that benefits one person has to necessarily harm another. That thinks of economics as what we call a zero sum game. That is, whenever one person does well, somebody else has to do poorly. So, like a professional sports league is this way. For every team that has a really good winning record, other teams have to lose in order for that team to win. So somebody has to beat somebody, somebody has to win, somebody has to lose. And so the records in a professional sports league are zero sum. That is, if you add up all the wins and you add up all the losses, they'll all be equal, right? For every win, there's a loss and vice versa. But trade isn't really like that, or money in an economy isn't really like that. And if you think about it that way, you're thinking about it the wrong way. You're thinking about it in a kind of primitive way. And so for example, this is what motivates a lot of things about, sort of international protectionism and tariffs and things like that. It's this assumption that there's only so much international trade, right? And if, you want to make sure that you get more of it than somebody else, or if somebody else gets more of it than you, then you've lost or something like that. But imagine trade as something like this. So imagine now that one person has 100 chickens, right? And they just can't do. I mean, there's all these chickens, and they're all going to die because they're all going to starve. And this person can't possibly eat 100 chickens in the time before they'll all sort of go bad. And so they have a surplus. They have more chickens than they need. Now imagine somebody else has 100 bushels of grain, right? Well, that's way more than they can possibly eat, right? Before it all goes bad. And and it's not all that appealing. It's just grain, 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 grain. That's it. No variety, no balance, right? You'll probably eventually get sick and die from such a diet of just eating one thing all the time. And so they both have surpluses, but they both have problems. Now imagine, and you're thinking to yourself, I'm sure, the obvious solution to this problem. How about they swap their surpluses, right? One of them, they take about half the grain and half the chickens or something like that, and just swap them. Then they both have chickens, and they both have ways of feeding the chickens, and they both have some grain to eat and some chickens to eat, right? And so the value of all that is actually much higher than just 100 chickens and 100 bushels of grain. They have both come out having more by just swapping their surpluses, more than the sum of its parts. That's what we mean by synergy, or a positive sum activity. That is, everybody does better. And that's really what profit is. So, for example, when I do, if I did work, if I was in marketing, I would do my work to, make an ad campaign and do all the proofreading and, make sure that you get all the copy right and, all the stuff, right? You get all the stuff that marketing people do. And then, the marketing campaign launches, you have advertisements out there and they have their effect, right? Well, somebody is paying me for my time and they're paying me what I believe my time is worth, right? And now, of course, my efforts, that's worth it to me. I've taken all that stuff and I'm better off for having done this thing. And now I'm taking my money and I'm paying other people to do things that I didn't do. I didn't grow my own food, so I'm going to pay somebody to do that. And so by dividing up things and specializing them, there's just this extra value that gets produced because people are trading their surpluses. Right? They're trading what they have more than enough of. If I have more than enough, sort of marketing skill, well, then I spend all day doing just marketing, right? And if I have, a farm, well, I spend all my day farming, right? And then I have to use when we trade surpluses, all that extra value gets created, and that's that extra value that makes a society that trades a lot better off than a society that doesn't trade at all, because then they don't specialize, right? And so that's what profit is it's a byproduct of all of that specialization and all of that savings, the economies of scale, and all the positive sum synergy that comes out of trade. And so it may not, in fact, be exploitation, although uh, there may be a sense in which too much profit really might be exploitative, right? It may be, after all, unfair if somebody takes too much out of the market value of a thing all for themselves, and the people that they hire, in ways that sort of as little as they can get away with. That might be exploitative, right? So again, the argument is not ridiculous. It may have some flaws to it, but those are some of the major issues in terms of Marx. So that puts a wrap then on our unit in both political justice and economic justice. Uh, there's a lot of complicated issues in this one. And there's a lot of key terms to be sure to get right. And so one of the things that I'd like to see, right, is that in sort of any discussions, both sort of on the boards and in papers and on exams and things like that, you try and be very patient in trying to explain the reasons, right, for having one of these views or another, rather than simply summarizing or saying, well, here's this view and it's good, or here's this view and it's bad, right? Well, look, again, all of these things have reasons why. They've all developed these sorts of arguments that say, well, here's the reason why this should be a certain way as opposed to another way, and here's the reason why we should think this way as opposed to that way. And most of them involve some kind of really good thought experiments that sort of lead people down a kind of critical path.